Hey everyone. Tonight, we're stepping back into a world where silence had meaning, where a young girl's quiet steps echoed louder than a senator's speech, and where fire, yes, literal fire, was considered the soul of an empire. Welcome to ancient Rome, a place of empires, ambition, and strange rituals. But tonight, we're not talking about Caesars or legions. We're focusing on a sisterhood unlike any other, the Vestal Virgins. Before we peel back the layers of myth, power, and marble facades, make yourself comfortable. Dim the lights. Let the hum of your room turn into the background noise of history. And join me as we explore a group of women Rome both worshipped and feared, its chosen daughters, its living omens, its most watched and isolated symbols of purity. In a society where bloodshed, conquest, and corruption ruled the day, there existed 6 girls, cloaked in white, tasked with something far more fragile than leading armies or writing laws. They had to keep a flame burning, literally. If that fire died, Rome panicked. Superstition would run wild. Senators pointed fingers. Priests scrambled to soothe the gods, and somewhere in the middle of it all, at the very center, stood a trembling girl who may have just yawned a little too close to the sacred hearth. But who were they, really? Let's set the scene. Rome was a city obsessed with order, signs, and symbolism. These priestesses weren't just holy women. They were sacred infrastructure, Rome's spiritual insulation. If they were calm, the city exhaled. If they faltered, even a little, it was like the sky had cracked open. The gods, it was believed, were watching constantly, and these girls were their barometers. Their behavior was not just personal, it was prophetic. And here's the twist. They weren't volunteers. They didn't dream of this life. They were chosen, hand-picked, taken, plucked from the safety of childhood like grapes from a vine. The process had a name. Captio, a seizure wrapped in the velvet robe of divine calling. Picture this. You're 6 years old, playing in your villa courtyard. You're humming to yourself, arranging your wax dolls. Suddenly, the door creaks open, and a man in elaborate robes, backed by armed officials, looks at your parents and says, "The gods have spoken. We'll be taking her now." There were rules, of course. The girl had to be whole, physically perfect, noble-born, soft-spoken, and quiet enough not to disturb the gods with her presence. A freckle in the wrong spot, a limp or too much curiosity. And she was passed over. But if you were the right kind of quiet, the right kind of pretty, the right kind of obedient, congratulations, you are now Rome's spiritual insurance policy. And the family, they didn't argue. They bowed their heads, whispered a prayer, and watched their daughter be escorted away to a new life. One of privilege, yes, but also of pressure. Because from that day forward, that girl no longer belonged to herself. She belonged to the goddess Vesta, to the temple, to the empire. They called it an honor. But what kind of honor begins with losing your name? Once chosen, the girl underwent a symbolic transformation. Her hair was cut, severed like the ties to her old life. That hair, once curled in childhood play, was buried like something sacred and lost. Her robes changed, her speech changed, her posture changed. And the city watched, nodding approvingly as a child was reshaped into a monument. She would be escorted to her new home, the House of the Vestals. It wasn't a prison, not technically. It was a gleaming palace of marble and fountains nestled beside the Roman Forum. It had gardens, private chambers, and the calm hush of reverence. But make no mistake, this was no paradise. This was an institution built to preserve order at all costs. You could stroll the courtyard, you could tend the plants, but step beyond those walls without permission. That was a violation so severe it could trigger public panic. To the Romans, purity was power, and the Vestals were walking vessels of that purity. Imagine the pressure. You are 8 years old. You wear sacred robes. People lower their voices when you pass. If you trip, citizens gasp. If you frown, someone whispers, "Is that an omen?" You're a teenager, and already the spiritual fate of the empire is being weighed on your every movement. And still, there was prestige. Unlike other Roman women who needed male guardians to buy property, testify in court, or even attend events, Vestals had autonomy. They could own land. They sat in places of honor. They wielded a kind of untouchable dignity. If a condemned man touched a Vestal on his way to execution, he was instantly pardoned. One brush of the sleeve, life or death reversed. But beneath that respect, beneath the fine sandals and spotless robes, lived a constant threat. A single misstep, a single whisper of scandal, and the very city that revered you could become the one that buried you, literally. Because breaking the vow of chastity meant one thing: being entombed alive. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, buried in a chamber, with a loaf of bread, a lamp, a jug of water, and a door that would never open again. All for letting the sacred fire go out, or letting your heart flicker like the flame you were sworn to protect. Welcome to the world of the Vestal Virgins. Inside the heart of ancient Rome, nestled among colonnades and echoing footpaths, there stood a house unlike any other. It wasn't a villa, though it shimmered with wealth. It wasn't a temple, though it pulsed with the sacred. It was the house of the Vestals, a sprawling sanctuary where girls became symbols and symbols became law. Here, amid sculpted fountains and marble corridors, 6 young women lived under the soft, watchful eye of a goddess. Their charge was not conquest, not commerce, not politics. It was fire. A flame. Simple in appearance, impossibly heavy in meaning. This sacred flame, lit in the round temple of Vesta, was not allowed to die, ever. Its flickering presence was thought to be the spiritual lifeblood of Rome. So long as it burned, the city would endure. But if it faltered, if ash replaced flame, if smoke gave way to silence, then all bets were off. Rome would panic, priests would tremble, omens would be read, and blame would rain down on the nearest Vestal like thunder. Tending that fire was a ritual, a rhythm of precision and poise. Vestals rose before dawn. They cleaned the hearth with tools only they were allowed to touch. They offered grain, oil, and incense. They whispered prayers, their voices trained never to rise above a sacred hush. And they worked in shifts, keeping the flame alive even through the cold. Watchful hours of the night. Imagine the intensity. You're 12 years old, still adjusting to the robes that never quite fit your shoulders. The wind howls, your hands tremble, but the fire must not die. You must kneel, chant, offer, and guard. All while appearing calm, collected, unshaken. Because to falter, to let your fear show, is to shake the confidence of an empire. Before they were trusted with the flame, Vestals endured 10 years of training, a decade of study, repetition, and the slow, deliberate construction of ritual muscle memory. They memorized chants in dead languages, practiced hand movements that had to be exact, and learned to walk with a kind of grace that suggested the gods themselves had polished their posture. Mistakes were not simply corrected. They were observed, recorded, and interpreted. A stutter in a chant, a misstep in a procession. That wasn't just clumsiness. It was a sign, and signs mattered in Rome. A Vestal who sneezed during a ritual might set off a month-long panic about divine disfavor. And while they trained, they were watched, or always watched, by senior Vestals, by priests, by guards, by Rome itself. Inside their 3-story sanctuary, the girls moved like ghosts through a gilded cage. They had private chambers. Yes, fine food, silken garments, even personal attendants. But freedom, that was not part of the design. They could walk the garden paths. They could speak to one another in hushed tones, perhaps even laugh. Softly. But the city just outside their marble walls was off limits. A few feet away, Rome bustled. Markets cried, men argued, life moved. But for the Vestals, all of that might as well have been another world. They lived not as citizens, not even as women, but as divine representatives, living artifacts of religious discipline. And yet, in this paradox, there was power. Unlike any other Roman woman, a Vestal was a legal adult. She could testify in court without a man's approval. She could own property, write a will, sign contracts. In a world where women were often spoken for, the Vestals spoke for the gods. But with that freedom came pressure. Every nod of the head, every blink of an eye was observed. If a Vestal looked sad in public, people whispered. If she stumbled on the temple steps, it wasn't just an accident. It was a cosmic red flag. Senators would debate it. Priests would fast. Sacrifices would be made. Because what if that slip meant the gods were angry? For Rome, the Vestals were more than priestesses. They were omens in human form. And the training never really ended. Even after the first 10 years of learning, the next decade, known as the period of full service, demanded perfection. Vestals became the spiritual multi-tools of the empire. They tended the fire, yes, but they also presided over rituals, blessed public ceremonies, and acted as guardians for Rome's most sacred legal documents. If a treaty was to be protected, it was stored with the Vestals. If a high-profile will needed safeguarding, it was placed under their care. Rome trusted them not just with its spiritual fate, but with its secrets. And still, they were expected to be invisible, present but quiet, powerful but serene. They were not to smile too broadly, nor frown too deeply. They were not to appear too happy, nor too tired. They had to strike a balance that bordered on supernatural. The perfect vessel, pure, neutral, unshakable. Failure was not tolerated. If the sacred flame died, even through no fault of their own, the punishment was swift. The responsible Vestal would be whipped, not in public, but in a dark, silent room under the pretense of preserving her dignity. The irony was sharp. Rome, the city of blood sports and open executions, pretending it could punish delicately, and yet the flame endured. For centuries, through invasions, plagues, assassinations, and civil wars. Through emperors who descended into madness and armies that marched across continents. The fire lived on because the Vestals refused to let it die, not because they were fearless, but because fear had been woven into their very breath. By the time a Vestal Virgin entered her second decade of service, the uncertainty of training had faded, replaced by a new, heavier certainty. Now, every move mattered. Gone were the days of whispered corrections, gentle redirections, and secret lessons shared in the marble courtyards of the Vestal house. Now she was the ritual itself, the flame's keeper, the public face of spiritual order. She was expected to perform, not with applause, but with absolute precision. And the audience? Rome itself. This middle decade was when a Vestal stepped into her full priestly power. No longer an apprentice, not yet a mentor, she became a living conduit between the city and the divine. Her hands lit sacred fires, her voice uttered the invocations that welcomed spring, honored treaties, and begged the gods to withhold their fury. Her presence at public ceremonies was like a divine insurance policy. If a Vestal watched, the gods were said to be watching too. She presided over purifications, elaborate rituals involving sacred waters, grain offerings, incense, and salt. If the air around Rome felt cursed or foul, the Vestals were called in to reset it. If the harvest failed, their movements were examined. If lightning struck the wrong hill, their expressions were scrutinized. They were, quite literally, the human firewall between Rome and cosmic chaos. And still, they were symbols first, people second. Their lives were structured by duty. They gathered only the purest wood for the flame. They cleaned the temple by ancient formula. They performed rites using implements so sacred that a misplaced broom or misaligned ladle could trigger waves of anxiety throughout the city. Nothing was casual. Nothing was just good enough. In Roman religion, there were no accidents, only omens. Even their silence spoke volumes. A Vestal never raised her voice, never argued, never allowed emotion to crack her facade. And yet she was watching everything, recording, interpreting. Rome's elite might boast, shout, and scheme, but beside them stood a young woman with a sacred stare, one whose mere frown could shake a senator's confidence. It was power wrapped in stillness, and yet, like all power, it came at a cost. The greatest expectation placed upon a Vestal, greater than guarding the flame, greater than preserving ritual form, was her vow of chastity. For 30 years, she was to remain untouched, above desire, untouched by mortal affection. Not because Rome believed in moral purity, but because Rome believed in symbolic protection. To them, the virginity of a Vestal was not personal, it was cosmic. It was as if her body were a sacred vault, and any hint of intimacy would fracture the very foundation of the city. Love, to a Vestal, wasn't just forbidden, it was treason. Other Roman women could marry, bear children, even seek modest influence through family alliances. But a Vestal's womb belonged to the goddess. Her heart was leased by the flame. Her silence, her calm, her distance, these weren't virtues. They were survival tactics. For in Rome, suspicion was a form of entertainment. A single look, a smile that lingered a second too long, a walk through the forum on the wrong feast day, these could be twisted into scandal. People whispered, priests investigated, and when the rumor took shape, the punishment was crueler than any scandal could justify. If a Vestal broke her vow, whether in truth or accusation, she was not executed, because technically she was too sacred to kill. So Rome found a loophole. She was buried alive in an underground chamber with a loaf of bread, a lamp, and a mouthful of hope. The city washed its hands. She was not murdered. She was merely left alone. It was Rome's way of saying, we revere you and we fear you, but we'll erase you all the same. What made it worse was the double standard. A man involved in a Vestal scandal was whipped to death in the forum, sure. But that wasn't the point. Roman men could indulge in excess, in lovers, in rumors, in wives lined up like columns in a villa. They were men, human, forgivable. Vestals, on the other hand, were not supposed to be human. They were divine, or at least they had to pretend. And if they ever forgot, if they ever allowed themselves to become too warm, too alive, too touched by the mortal world, they were punished not for lust, but for disrupting the illusion that Rome so desperately clung to. And so they endured, through ceremonies, droughts, games, rituals, and funerals, through decades of sacred silence and spotless performance, all while the city watched. Not always with love, but always with expectation. They were glorified, they were constrained, and eventually, when their final ritual year arrived, they became something even more powerful. They became teachers. After 20 years of guarding Rome's most sacred traditions, of rising before dawn to serve a goddess who never slept, a Vestal Virgin reached a threshold, not of rest, not yet, but of transformation. She was no longer the trembling girl who had whispered her first prayers beneath vaulted ceilings. She was not the wide-eyed novice trying not to drop sacred grain. She had become something else entirely, the embodiment of control. Her body moved with ritual precision. Her voice could silence a forum. Her presence at public ceremonies held the weight of centuries, and now the city expected her to pass on that perfection, to replicate it in those who would one day take her place. This was the final decade. 10 years not of training or performing, but of teaching. She became a mentor, a quiet architect of the next generation. The lessons she taught were not written in scrolls. They were etched in posture, tone, gaze, and stillness. Her authority was not loud, but it was absolute. When she corrected a novice, it wasn't a suggestion, it was scripture. She taught them how to walk like they belonged to no man, how to kneel without trembling, how to offer without hesitation. She showed them where to place the sacred ladle, how to read the smoke, how to feel the wind shift in a ritual courtyard, and know whether it meant joy or doom. She reminded them, again and again, that they were no longer girls. They were symbols. Rome did not expect their humanity. It expected their silence, their stillness, their sanctity, and she enforced that expectation like a sentinel made of marble. Mistakes were not tolerated. If a novice spilled sacred grain or spoke too loudly, she wouldn't be scolded. She would receive the stare, that cold, weighted gaze from a woman who had survived 2 decades without cracking. The stare that said, "I've kept this fire alive longer than you've been alive. Don't be the one who breaks it." But her teachings weren't just ritual. She passed down survival knowledge. 2, unwritten wisdom etched in fear and repetition. Like how to keep your face neutral when a senator screams about signs in the sky, how to breathe during the long, sweltering ceremonies without fainting, how to avoid being alone with a man, even a priest, even in daylight, because appearances mattered more than truth. Above all, she taught them how to carry the weight of being essential and disposable at the same time. She reminded them, often without words, that Rome's love came with conditions. Because the city did love its Vestals, adored them, celebrated them with front-row seats at gladiator games, granted them the right to own land, sign contracts, and walk freely in public, a level of autonomy no other Roman woman possessed. But that love was conditional. It lasted exactly as long as the flame kept burning. Exactly as long as their bodies remained pure. Exactly as long as they gave Rome what it needed, an illusion of eternal control. And beneath the marble calm, every senior Vestal knew the truth. She had seen peers disgraced. She had attended the trial of a Vestal accused of love, watched the city turn cold, the priests sharpen their rituals, the people nod solemnly as one of their sacred sisters was led to her fate underground. She had walked those halls after the chamber was sealed. She had passed by the place where firelight did not reach. So when she told the novices, "Breathe carefully," she wasn't being poetic. She was passing down the only protection they had, discipline. By the end of her 3rd decade, a Vestal had seen everything. She had served the gods, shielded the state, taught the sacred, and never once allowed herself to want. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it ended. Retirement. A word that meant something different for a Vestal. She had been taken as a child. She had served for 30 years. Now finally, she was released, not from memory, not from ritual, but from obligation. Rome, for once, kept its promise. She was free. But what did freedom mean to someone who had never been allowed to live? When the 30 years were complete, when the sacred vows had been fulfilled, when the last chant had left her lips and the final ritual bowed its head, a Vestal Virgin became something rare. A woman in Rome with no master, no husband, and no obligation to anyone. She had been claimed by the gods before she could speak in her own name. Now, at perhaps 40 years old, she was released, not into obscurity, but into the dangerous unknown of civilian life. The marble doors of the Vestal house opened, and for the first time in 3 decades, she was allowed to walk the streets as herself. But who was that? She had no family waiting, no career to return to, no idea how ordinary life functioned. She had lived apart from it for so long that even simple things, bartering in a market, walking unobserved, felt foreign. The world she re-entered had changed, and so had she. But while the empire shifted, she had remained fixed like a statue overlooking a storm. And now she wasn't a symbol anymore. She was just a woman, but not quite, because Rome never truly let go of its priestesses. People still bowed their heads when they passed her. Some offered whispered blessings. Others crossed the street, uncertain whether to treat her like a holy relic or a strange reminder of a religion older than the current fashion. She had the legal rights of a man. She could own property. She could manage wealth. She could speak in court and have her testimony carry the weight of the gods. Senators respected her. Merchants catered to her. And yet none of it felt like power. Not really, because for 30 years she had been watched. Now, for the first time, she was simply seen. And freedom, as it turned out, was exhausting. Many retired Vestals chose not to marry. They could. They were legally allowed to, but most didn't. How could they, after living untouched, unswayed by affection or companionship, how could they re-enter a world where they'd be expected to serve again? This time, not the gods, but a husband. To many of them, it must have felt like swapping one set of chains for another. Those who did marry often struggled. The rhythms of domestic life, the laughter, the arguments, the chaos, felt overwhelming. For 30 years, every moment had been ordered. Every emotion had been suppressed, every instinct watched. And now they were expected to be wives. Mothers? Some of them managed. Others quietly faded, preferring solitude, gardens, books, or the quiet company of women who remembered what silence used to mean. And yet, retirement offered its quiet joys. For the first time, a former Vestal could walk without ritual, smile without it being interpreted as a divine sign, speak without fearing that a single wrong word might offend a god or doom a harvest. She could attend festivals and feel only pleasure, not the weight of cosmic responsibility. She could taste fruit, buy fabric, bathe in light, and know that no one was measuring her purity by the flicker of her expression. But no matter how far she walked, Rome never truly forgot. People stared, children whispered. And even years after retirement, if she passed by, someone might say, "There goes the flame-bearer." Not in mockery, not even in reverence, but with the kind of awe reserved for ghosts that once mattered. Because even without the white robes, even without the veil, the years clung to her. You don't spend 3 decades living as a symbol and expect to simply return to flesh. She had been fire. Now she was ash. But even ash can carry heat. For nearly 1,000 years, the Vestal Virgins had stood at the center of Rome's spiritual identity. Through the founding myths of the Republic, through the rise of Caesars, through plagues and wars and fires, their white-robed figures had remained constant, eternal in a city obsessed with control. Theirs was a lineage older than emperors, more enduring than dynasties. But no institution lasts forever, not even the sacred ones. By the late 4th century CE, Rome had begun to change, not with riots or invasions, those would come later, but with ideas. New beliefs were taking root in the empire's soil. Christianity, once persecuted in dark alleys and hidden tombs, was rising. It no longer whispered from the shadows. Now it spoke from palaces, and Rome listened. The old gods, the ones fed with grain, song, and fire, were beginning to starve. The temple of Vesta still stood, its eternal flame still tended by women who had spent decades perfecting stillness. But outside those marble walls, the winds of belief had shifted. The emperor no longer looked to Jupiter. The people no longer feared omens. The empire, once held together by shared rituals, was unbraiding itself into a new kind of faith. And so came the man who would do what no disaster, scandal, or rebellion had managed. He would end the flame. In the year 394 CE, Emperor Theodosius I, a devout Christian determined to purify the empire of its pagan roots, issued a decree. The Vestals were to be disbanded, their temple shuttered, their sacred flame extinguished. There was no trial, no riot, no divine thunder, just silence. And in that silence, 1,000 years of ritual died. The flame that had once been lit with sunlight, tended with trembling devotion, and feared with holy awe, faded into smoke. Not because a Vestal failed, not because of scandal, but because the world had changed its mind. Imagine the last day. The marble floors of the Temple of Vesta cool beneath bare feet. The sacred tools, so long handled with reverence, now resting idle on the altar. The air, once thick with incense and whispered prayers, now quiet as dust settles. And 6 women, some just girls, others nearing retirement, watching as the gods they served are quietly erased from official memory. What do you do with devotion when the world no longer wants it? Some of the former Vestals were absorbed into noble families, their sacred status rebranded as aristocratic prestige. Others quietly retired, their names fading from public records. A few remained near the Forum, living shadows of a lost era, their steps echoing through streets that no longer bowed. The house of the Vestals fell into neglect. Its once pristine courtyards where fountains danced and roses bloomed, cracked and crumbled. Rain pooled where prayers had once risen. Statues wore vines like veils. The city grew up around the ruins, built over memory like a child forgetting its mother's voice. No thunderbolt came. No earthquake split the ground in protest. Rome did not fall the moment the flame died. Life continued. Markets opened. Soldiers drilled. The gods stayed silent. But something deep within the city shifted. Because when the flame went out, it wasn't just fire that was lost. It was belief. It was ritual. It was the idea that 6 silent girls could hold together an empire through the weight of their stillness. The Vestal Virgins weren't warriors. They didn't hold office. They commanded no armies, forged no treaties, and built no monuments bearing their names. And yet, their presence weighed more than marble. Their silence echoed louder than the roar of the Colosseum. Because in a city obsessed with signs and symbols, they were the symbol, not of conquest, but of balance. They were Rome's heartbeat, but a heartbeat that had to remain steady, unchanging, unnoticed. Their power wasn't loud. It didn't march in triumphal processions or issue decrees. It stood still, watched, waited, tended fire, and in that stillness, the city saw itself. But it wasn't just reverence that surrounded them, it was fear. The Vestals lived at the dangerous crossroads of myth, politics, and superstition. One wrong breath, one tremor in their voice, and Rome would panic. Was the goddess angry? Was the city cursed? Did a Vestal trip on the temple stairs, or was it a sign? They were women transformed into symbols, and symbols are not allowed to be human. This fear of their fragility made their purity a national obsession. Their bodies became the empire's metaphor. Their chastity was linked, absurdly and cruelly, to the fate of the city itself. If they fell, Rome believed, so would everything else. And so, when disaster struck, floods, bad harvests, eclipses, someone had to take the blame, and that someone was often the most visible target wearing the whitest robes. A Vestal didn't need to be guilty to be punished. She only needed to be suspected. The trial of a Vestal accused of breaking her vow was not a search for truth. It was a ceremony of fear. The city needed an answer. The gods needed appeasement. And so, in the name of balance, she would be sacrificed. Not publicly. That would be barbaric. No, Rome prided itself on being civilized. So it buried her alive, gently. A chamber would be dug beneath the earth. Inside, a bed, a lamp, some bread, and a small flask of water. She would be led there in silence, veiled, untouched, untouchable. The priests would speak soft prayers, pretending not to notice that no one was saving her. The door would be sealed. Rome would exhale, and the gods, presumably, would be satisfied. What made it more terrifying was how swiftly the city could turn. One day, a Vestal could be walking through the Forum, watched with awe and respect. The next, she could become a scapegoat for the empire's unrest. She wasn't hated. She was used, because the Vestals were Rome's purest paradox. They were honored, yet imprisoned. They were free by law, yet confined by ritual. They were independent, but not their own. And perhaps that is why their legacy feels so powerful even now. Because they carried the weight of being both sacred and sacrificed, and they did so in silence. For centuries. They remind us that power can wear robes instead of armor. That devotion can be shaped into duty so rigid it becomes a cage. That women, so often denied agency in ancient Rome, could wield extraordinary influence, not through command, but through symbolic presence. And perhaps that was the cruelest part. They were the most powerful women in Rome, and they couldn't even hold hands with someone they loved. Long after their fire went cold, after the last ritual was performed, the last vow whispered, the last white robe folded neatly on a marble bench, the memory of the Vestal Virgins did not die. Not entirely. It remained, like smoke that clings to stone long after the flame has vanished. Rome moved on, the Forum filled with Christian processions instead of pagan rites. The emperor stopped consulting augurs and started building churches. Statues of gods were toppled or quietly repurposed into saints. But somewhere in the cracks of the New World, the ghost of the Vestals endured. Tourists now walk the ruins of the Roman Forum, where the temple of Vesta once stood. They gaze at broken columns, sun-bleached marble, and a patch of earth where the sacred fire once burned. The pool in the courtyard still reflects light in the late afternoon, and the wind that drifts through the crumbling walls still carries a hush, as though the city itself remembers how to be quiet. Children play nearby, unaware that centuries ago, this was a place where silence meant survival. But for those who pause, who listen closely, it's still possible to feel them. Not as individuals. Their names are mostly lost. The records were never meant to preserve their stories, only their service. But what remains is the idea of them, women carved out of ritual, shaped by duty, and buried in the architecture of an empire. Historians argue over the details. Were they empowered or imprisoned? Were they volunteers or victims? Was their role a mark of progress, or the ultimate illusion of it? And perhaps the answer is yes to all of it. Because the Vestals didn't just serve Rome, they were Rome. They embodied its contradictions, its grandeur and cruelty, its obsession with symbolism, and its fear of chaos. In them, the empire poured its need for control, its hunger for purity, and its desperate belief that if you just followed the right rituals, the world would stay in place. That belief didn't die with the Vestals. It transformed. Whispers of them live on in literature, in the image of the serene, silent woman at the heart of the storm. In every story of women turned into saints or scapegoats. In every tradition that asks women to be pure, perfect, and selfless in the service of something larger than themselves. And in every quiet act of rebellion, every time a woman refuses to be a symbol, refuses to be silent, refuses to be used, we feel the embers of the Vestals glowing again, not in a temple, but in memory, in myth, in the shared, sacred fire of those who remember that sometimes the quietest people are the ones who carried the heaviest burdens. The Vestal Virgins did not conquer lands or write laws, but they held the weight of a civilization in their hands and never let it fall. Not until the empire itself chose to turn away, not until the flame, faithfully kept through centuries of darkness, was snuffed out, not by failure, but by forgetting. And even then, a part of it still burns. The last Vestal Virgin may have passed into silence over 1,600 years ago, but the image of her never fully disappeared. It survived, not as a historical memory, but as a myth wrapped in white robes and bound by fire. Rome's fascination with control didn't end when the empire fell. It simply evolved, and in the centuries that followed, as new rulers claimed power, as new religions shaped the moral imagination of Europe, the ghost of the Vestals wandered with them, less as women and more as metaphors.
The Vestal Virgin became a figure in art, in poetry, in political theory. She was purity personified, the untouched ideal. The very same Rome that once buried her alive for love now raised statues to her dignity. Painfully ironic, perhaps, but deeply telling. For what is more useful to a society built on hierarchy than the idea of a woman who says nothing, who loves no one, who sacrifices everything for the greater good, and smiles while doing it? In the Middle Ages, stories of the Vestals were whispered by scholars and scribes, cloaked in Christian reinterpretations. The Virgin Mary became a more tender version of Vesta. Monasteries, though different in purpose, echoed some of the same rituals: silence, celibacy, separation from the world. Nuns, too, carried symbolic burdens. In the Renaissance, artists painted the Vestals as pale and delicate, often gazing into fires or turning from temptation. They were posed in perfect composure, eternal daughters of discipline. Not one of them ever appears laughing. In the Enlightenment, philosophers debated the Vestal's role. Were they victims of patriarchal theater or rare examples of female autonomy? The answers always said more about the men debating than the women they invoked. By the Victorian era, the word Vestal had become a stand-in for any woman considered morally superior, sexually untouched, or tragically beautiful. But the humanity behind the term was long gone. The real Vestals, the flesh-and-blood girls taken from their homes, trained to perfection, burdened with impossible symbolism, and entombed at the first sign of failure, had become ghosts wearing veils. Convenient ideals, beautiful symbols, and yet their legacy refuses to settle neatly, because the Vestals were never just pure, they were powerful. Their testimony could overrule a senator, their touch could pardon the condemned. They walked the streets of Rome alone, veiled and respected, while other women needed a man to speak for them. They were both prisoners and exceptions to the rule. In a world where women were considered the property of their fathers, husbands, or sons, the Vestals answered to no one but the goddess. And perhaps that's why their image endured, not just for what it meant, but for what it threatened. Because a Vestal, by her very existence, showed that women could be trusted with sacred power, until the moment society decided they couldn't. And that balance, between reverence and fear, is not unique to ancient Rome. Even today, echoes remain. In every debate about what a woman should or shouldn't wear, about how she should speak, whom she should love, what she owes her country, her family, her faith, there is a flicker of that old fire. In every time a woman is honored for her silence, then punished for her voice. In every moment a society worships her purity, then condemns her for being human. The Vestals are still with us, not in temples, not in rituals, but in the stories we tell, the ideals we demand, the burdens we quietly pass down. They remind us that power given conditionally is not freedom, that silence can be sacred, but it can also be a sentence, and that when a woman is turned into a symbol, she is often the first to be buried when the symbol breaks. The flame did not go out in thunder. There was no riot in the Forum, no lightning bolt over the Palatine, no divine scream from the heavens. There was only a whisper, a decree, a quiet bureaucratic end to a 1,000-year-old vow. When Emperor Theodosius I outlawed the old pagan rites, he did not smash altars with a sword. He used law, paper, authority, and with one signature the Temple of Vesta, Rome's oldest sacred site, was closed, its fires extinguished, its priestesses dismissed. It was not a spectacle. It was an ending so quiet it felt like forgetting. No gods protested. No plague followed. The earth did not split beneath the city. For the first time in centuries, Rome realized something terrifying. It could continue without its symbols. That realization did not come easily. Some Romans waited for omens. They walked past the darkened temple and expected signs, crows screaming at dusk, unnatural winds, a harvest blighted by divine withdrawal. But the sky remained blue. The grain grew. Life continued. And yet something had changed. It wasn't just the fire that died. It was a world view. For centuries, the people of Rome had believed that the empire was a kind of machine, one powered not just by politics or armies, but by rituals, omens, and the careful choreography of belief. The Vestals were the gears that made it all feel steady. Their silence made Rome feel protected. Their discipline made chaos feel manageable. Their purity made the gods seem close. With them gone, Rome lost more than a ceremony. It lost the illusion that everything could be controlled. Because the truth is, the Vestals had never actually held the empire together. They had simply given the people something to look at when things felt uncertain. A flame, a veil, a girl kneeling in prayer. These were comforts. Ancient placebos against the rising tide of history. And history at last had rolled in. The Vestals did not fail. They did not falter. They did exactly what they were asked to do. They preserved the rituals, tended the fire, stood still while the world moved around them. But the world outgrew its own imagination. It no longer feared omens. It feared politics. It feared war. It feared new gods, not old ones. And in that new fear there was no room for sacred flames and silent girls. So the temple of Vesta was abandoned. The fires were not rekindled. The marble cracked. The sacred tools were left to rust, and the house of the Vestals, once gleaming with ritual perfection, filled slowly with silence, dust, and weeds. Rome did not collapse that day, but something inside it closed. A chapter, a breath, a rhythm. The world turned, and the fire that had once anchored the empire flickered quietly into history. Time is not kind to symbols. It wears them down, not with violence but with indifference. The gods change. The stones crack, names blur into dust, and the people who once trembled before a sacred fire eventually forget why it mattered, but the fire remembers, and so do the places where it once lived. The Temple of Vesta is no longer a place of ritual. It is a ruin, a broken ring of columns standing quietly in the Roman Forum. Tourists pass by. They take pictures. Some pause to read a plaque. Few understand what they're looking at. But the air still feels different there. Even now. In the right light, when the sun slants through the marble, when the breeze dies down and the city quiets, if you stand still enough, you can almost hear it. Not voices, not prayers, a presence. Not divine, human. The weight of all those years. Of a 6-year-old girl taken from her family, stripped of her name and reshaped into myth. Of teenagers kneeling before a flame, not because they understood, but because they were told the entire world depended on their composure. Of women who lived inside stone walls and learned to interpret silence like a language. Of hands that touched sacred objects with reverence, while their own bodies were treated as sacred objects to be guarded, watched, judged. And of the day it all stopped. No war, no rebellion, just the closing of a temple door that would never open again. It's easy to think of the Vestals as relics, products of a superstitious time, strange footnotes in a brutal empire's religious pageantry. But that would miss the point, because the Vestals weren't just about Rome. They were about us, about our need to assign meaning to order. Our desire to believe that if we just behave the right way, follow the right rules, keep the right flame alive, the world won't fall apart. They were about fear disguised as faith, discipline mistaken for destiny, purity demanded by those who feared complexity, and women, always women, tasked with holding the structure in place, asked to bear the burden of civilization's balance while never being allowed to stumble. The Vestals remind us what happens when we confuse symbolism for safety, when we build systems that are too fragile to tolerate imperfection, when we elevate individuals into ideals and then punish them for acting human. But they also remind us of strength, not the strength of conquest, but of endurance, of repetition, of staying still when the world turns, of bearing the unbearable, not because they wanted to, but because they were told it mattered. And for nearly 1,000 years they believed it. Maybe that's why we still talk about them, not because they lit fires, but because they carried something heavier: faith, in a system that never truly protected them, in a God who never spoke, in a city that remembered their silence longer than their names. Walk the Forum today and you'll find noise, vendors humming, guides pointing, the tap of sandals over stone, laughter echoing off columns that once bore witness to executions, to victories, to vows. But if you step carefully, just once off the tourist path past the broken archways and into the quieter ruins, you might feel something different. Not a ghost, not a god, just a weight, a pause in the air, a breath withheld by time. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need to. It is the memory of women whose lives were written in rituals instead of ink, whose words never survived because silence was part of their worship, who were remembered not by what they said but by how well they didn't speak. Rome recorded its triumphs, its battles, its orators, its emperors, but the Vestals, they left no speeches, no manifestos, no rebellion scratched into cell walls, only the faintest traces of movement, a procession carved into relief, a statue head with empty eyes, the ruins of a courtyard where the grass grows wild now, untended. And yet they mattered, more than many of the men whose names still haunt our history books, because what the Vestals carried wasn't power in the traditional sense. It was something older, stranger, sacred not because it was celebrated, but because it was fragile. They carried a civilization's fear of collapse, its obsession with control, its desperate attempt to tie the cosmic to the domestic. To say, look, here is purity, here is order. As long as this flame burns, the gods love us still. They were Rome's reassurance, its symbol of divine favor, its emotional firewall against chaos, and when that was no longer needed, they were set aside, quietly, like a ritual no longer fashionable. But symbols are stubborn things, they linger. And so the Vestals live on, not in fire but in story. They live in the way we talk about purity as virtue, in the way we demand perfection from those we elevate, in the way we still confuse silence with strength. They live in every system that holds someone to an impossible standard, then punishes them for breathing. And perhaps most of all, they live in the ruins, the cracked stones that once rang with their sandals, the courtyards where their shadows once passed at dawn, the broken altar that once warmed their careful hands. Because the flame they carried wasn't just fire, it was belief. And belief, when tended long enough, burns its way into the bones of a city, even after the gods have left, even after the people forget, even after the world has moved on. They told me my name once. Before the veil, before the silence, before my hands smelled of ash and my prayers became muscle memory, I had a name. It was spoken in the garden, where I played with wax dolls beneath lemon trees. It was whispered in my mother's kitchen in lullabies and laughter. My name meant something soft, something warm, but that name was taken from me the day the priest touched my shoulder and said, "Ti amata capio," I seize you, beloved. And I was gone. That first night in the house of the Vestals, I did not sleep. The marble was cold. The silence was heavy. My hair had been cut. I touched my scalp and felt the absence, like something sacred had been buried without a funeral. They said the gods were pleased, that I had been chosen, that I was holy now, but I did not feel holy. I felt small, and watched. They dressed me in white, not the white of celebration but of expectation, of clarity so pure it became a kind of prison. I was taught how to walk, how to kneel, how to offer without trembling. They measured my posture, my breath, my stillness. I learned to smile in ways that did not invite interpretation. My hands grew steady. My gaze grew calm. I learned not to miss home, not because I stopped missing it, but because missing something you cannot return to is a waste of ritual. Each morning, I woke to the sound of sandals in the corridor. Each night I closed my eyes beneath the watch of gods who never answered. I tended the fire with care, as if it were the only thing keeping my heart from going out too. And maybe it was. They said if I let the flame die, the city would suffer. What they did not say was that I would suffer first. I watched the city through the veil. I saw women with babies in their arms, lovers leaning close in markets, old men feeding birds. None of them noticed me. Or if they did, they looked away as if my presence reminded them that something in life could not be touched. I envied their imperfection, their noise, their freedom to be seen as human. Sometimes in the deep hours of night when the coals glowed low and my sisters slept, I whispered my old name into the darkness, not aloud, just in memory. I pictured my mother's hands, my father's laugh, the shadow of the lemon tree. But the memory always ended the same way, with silence, with duty, with another offering made, another ritual completed, another piece of myself traded for the illusion of eternal calm. And yet, despite everything, I do not regret the fire. It was the only thing that asked nothing of me. It burned because it must. And so did I. They said I was free, that I could walk the streets now like anyone else, that I could eat when I chose, speak as I wished, sleep without rising to tend the fire, that I was no longer bound to the goddess, no longer Rome's sacred daughter. But no one tells you how heavy freedom feels when you've only ever worn obedience. The day they removed my veil, I didn't know where to put my hands. They had always been busy, adjusting folds of white linen, lifting sacred vessels, feeding the flame. Now they floated awkwardly at my sides, unsure of what they were for. I stood in the center of the room and felt the chill of being unobserved for the first time in my life. No priest watching, no sister correcting, no God listening, just me, and a silence that was no longer sacred. The streets of Rome looked different without the veil, bigger, faster. I walked them slowly as if I might trip on a memory. People stared, not out of reverence anymore, but confusion. Who is she? They seemed to ask. Not wife, not widow, not merchant, not mother, just a former flame keeper. Some bowed their heads as I passed, instinctively. Others looked away, uncomfortable. Once I overheard a child ask her mother, "Why does that lady walk like marble?" I smiled. It was the first time I'd heard someone describe me without fear. They say I can marry now, that I could find a man to guide me through the rest of my life. But what man would know how to hold a woman who once held the fate of an empire in her breath? I have known the stillness of gods. I have learned to keep secrets from my own heartbeat. I am not made for the noise of love. And yet I long for touch, not desire, just warmth, a hand on my shoulder, a shared laugh without consequence. 30 years of silence hum in my ears. Sometimes I reach for a bowl with both hands, even though I no longer need to. Sometimes I walk in measured steps without meaning to. Sometimes I wake at dawn looking for a flame that is no longer mine. The rituals still live in my body. Rome has forgotten me. That is its way. The city worships its symbols until they become inconvenient. But I have not forgotten myself. I remember the first time I saw fire, not the eternal flame, but the kind that dances, that flickers for joy, not duty. I was 5. My father burned olive branches in the courtyard, and I watched the sparks rise into the dusk like prayers that needed no temple. Sometimes now, in the quiet of my small home, I light a candle, not to Vesta, not to Rome, to myself, to the girl I was before the silence, to the woman I became because of it, and to the truth that no one teaches you, that even when the veil is gone, you never really take it off. Every civilization builds statues, some of stone, some of silence, some of women, and the tallest are never meant to last forever. They rise on promises, on myths, on the fragile hope that if you hold something still long enough, pure enough, it will protect everything else from falling. The Vestal Virgins were Rome's tallest statue. They stood without moving, spoke without speaking, loved without loving, carried the empire's need for order in the hollow space where their hearts should have been allowed to beat freely. But all pedestals are traps. What begins as reverence becomes expectation. What begins as worship becomes weight. What begins as sacred becomes sacrificed. And so we watch again and again, as the world exalts its women, lifts them high, demands perfection, insists on purity, and then shames them for faltering, for aging, for breaking, for breathing. The Vestals were not just a religious order. They were a warning that when we turn people into symbols, we forget they are mortal, that when we demand stillness, we kill the dance, that when we call silence sacred, we often mean, do not make us uncomfortable. But the truth is, the fire always goes out, not because someone failed, but because the world changes its mind, and those left standing in the ashes are rarely the ones who made the rules. They are the ones who obeyed them longest. So let this be the final vigil, not for the gods who vanished, nor the empire that fell, but for the women who were never meant to be remembered as people, only as proof. That silence could be shaped into power, that obedience could be divine, that a girl could be taken, trained, erased, and called holy for surviving it. But we remember now, not the flames, the hands that fed them, not the veils, the eyes behind them, not the silence, the voices that were never written down, we remember. And memory, too, is a kind of fire, one we carry forward quietly, but burning, always burning.